Welcome to All the F Words,
a podcast where two writer friends, nearly 30 years apart, explore everything we give an F about. I'm Gabi Moskowitz.
And I'm Joanne Green. On each episode of All the F Words, we'll focus on a theme starting with the letter F. Things like fortitude, free love, fashion, and faux pas.
We'll share stories from our lives and our distinct generational perspectives and look to the experts for insights and ideas.
Today we're talking about filibuster, a powerful concept that has a history in this country and possibly a future of change.
It's a term we've all heard, but I'm guessing that a lot of us don't really understand the nuances. I know it's something to do with the dragging out of the discussion of an issue endlessly so that there's never a vote.
You are right, my friend, but I dare say there is more to a filibuster than meets the eye.
How long has the term and the option been in use?
About 100 years. It was created as an option after World War I, and as you described, it is literally the process of extending debate endlessly to avoid voting on an issue.
Just in the Senate, right?
Yeah, the Senate, which has 100 members, all of whom come to know one another to some degree. House is much, much bigger, so you don't necessarily know all of your fellow congresspeople. For a long time, Gabi, the filibuster existed, but it was rarely used. They described it as a nuclear option. You know it's there, but it's going to take some extreme conditions to ever consider using it.
Was there a way to end a filibuster? Could enough senators force an end to the debate and require the Senate to vote?
Yes, and that's called cloture. It required 2/3 of all senators to stop a filibuster, and cloture was even more rare in the Senate than the filibuster.
Okay, so what changed?
Actually, and I think this may be a surprise to some people, Democrats made the change, and it was in the 1970s. At the time, they held the majority in the Senate, and they changed the 2/3 requirement to shut down a filibuster to a 3/5 majority. I know this is very detailed, but 2/3 to 3/5 is a really big difference.
Yeah, I wasn't really very good at fractions, but I'll take your word for it. So what was the practical result?
Well, no longer was the filibuster viewed as a nuclear option. The threat of a filibuster became totally commonplace.
This sounds like what happens when I try to put my 4-year-old to bed. So who used it?
It's always the minority party in the Senate that uses it, or any individual senator.
Is this why Congress can't seem to pass any new legislation?
It is a big piece of the puzzle for sure. And that is why there's now a movement to carve out an exemption for, say, like one issue. The one that people are talking about right now is voting rights.
And what's the holdup?
Well, changing the Senate rules would require all Democratic senators to vote for the change. And there are a couple of Democratic senators who are currently refusing. I'm guessing that you can guess who one or two of them might be.
Yes, I'm raising my hand. Senator Joe Manchin.
Bingo. Of West Virginia. He is said to be the most conservative Democrat in the Senate.
And who else?
Senator Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona. So here's one of the things about the filibuster. It was used over and over again as a way of blocking civil rights legislation. In fact, in his remarks at the funeral of John Lewis in July of 2020, former President Obama called the filibuster a Jim Crow relic. He said it should be eliminated if it's used to block voting reforms. The thing about all of this, Gabi, and we can dig a lot deeper on filibuster, but I think the thing that really intrigues me, I'm guessing you and most of our listeners, is this idea of a stalemate, the idea of getting to a point where two parties create ways to prevent compromise. And that is just, it happens all over the place. It happens in Congress. It happens in labor disputes. It happens on the ball field, right? When kids are playing and can't, my way. No, it's got to be my way. So I'd like to dig a little bit deeper on stalemates in general.
Well, it's kind of like the first thing that comes to mind is it's like the number one rule of marriage. that saying, do you want to be right or do you want to be married? And I think one of the things, and we talked a little bit about this in our fighting episode, but one of the things that is really hard for me, I'm a stubborn person. I'm an interesting combination of, well, I think it's interesting. I don't know if other people think it's interesting. Combination of conflict averse, but also very stubborn.
I've never seen your stubborn side.
Well, that's because I'm really conflict averse. but when my husband does or says something and I know he is, and I believe he is wrong, and I am right and my way is right, it gets to this point, especially when we come to an impasse where I really have to remember to place the relationship first. And this is so clearly one of the things that's causing so much. I mean, there are a lot of things causing the polarity in politics right now, the polar divide. But I often find myself having to do this work whenever my husband and I disagree about something, where it's like, we have to get back to being on the same side of we have to get whatever it is that's come between us. Let's fight our way back to trying to see each other's perspectives so that we can, stop making this about battling over a subject and realign as partners trying to, manage a house and kids and our respective lives. And it's so hard to do, but it's the only way forward. And it's the only thing to do if you value the relationship, in my experience. So, I mean,
it's so critical also to pick your battles, right? And to know that there are going to be smaller battles that you can just afford to lose when you have your eye on the big prize. And I think there are some people, our former president among them, who simply cannot lose. They don't know how to lose. I mean, one of the interesting things, and I have to mention something about the Warriors right now, because for those of us in the Bay Area, we're still basking in the afterglow of the championship. But one of
those
the things
of us who follow basketball, so I'm glad. There's something good happened. They won something. I'm glad about that.
Yeah, they definitely won. But here's the thing. There's a lot about how they function that is a role model for the rest of us. And one of the things that's been said about some of the key players on the team is that they know how to lose. And not a lot of superstars, certainly, in athletics or in really any field, know how to lose. And it's part of the deal. It's part of life. It's part of the game. And politics is a game, I think, to a large degree. And knowing how to lose, regroup, and move forward is ultimately in everybody's best interests. So it's interesting. Democrats, getting back to the filibuster for just a minute, Democrats are fighting to at least amend it, if not end it right now. But they're the ones that tweaked the filibuster when they were in the majority. And that's really why we have a Supreme Court looking like we do right now, because they exempted presidential nominations to the Supreme Court. That didn't, they exempted that from, where you could use the filibuster. And that's why we have Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court. So this is a case where a tactic backfired, right? But people take a look at that and go, oh, well, we don't want that to happen to us again. The filibuster itself, I would say, is undemocratic. I would really go so far as to say that, because what it does is it empowers the minority to block the will of the voters. And it's going to be used by Republicans to block every single progressive priority, even in the best case scenario where Democrats control the House, the Senate, and the White House. They can continue to do this. And they have said they're going to do this.
Well, it takes something that could be an intellectual and relational exchange and turns it into who is willing to to refuse to cooperate for the longest. And I wasn't joking when I said it reminded me of my 4-year-old at bedtime. When it is bedtime, I'm the grown up, right? Like my child is 4. I say when it's bedtime. And but I'm also a connected and relational mommy, and I don't want to just impose rules and lock the door. So we try to have a conversation about it. But like when she doesn't, most of the time she goes to bed, no problem. But when she doesn't want to go to bed, she employs every trick in the book. She's got to go potty. She needs more water. I have seen my child intentionally spill water down the front of her jammy top so that I will have to help her put on a dry, clean one. Like it's like all of a sudden her strategic mind just like snaps into action. And but if you look at that is someone who is using every trick in the book to not cooperate. And she's 4, and that's developmentally appropriate. But it puts the other person in the position of having to use ultimate force. And by that, I mean, sorry, no, I'm closing the door and then putting her to bed. But in a political grown-up, situation with very real, risks, that's a terrible way to run a government.
It is a terrible way, which is why there's no filibuster written into the Constitution. So our founders really understood history, and they had good reason to fear the consequences of a legislature that was addicted to minority rule. So here's what I have to get a little nerdy on you for a second here. Here's what Alexander Hamilton wrote in the Federalist. If a pernicious minority can control the opinion of a majority, the government situation must always savor of weakness, sometimes border upon anarchy. So, wow. They knew this. The filibuster was used for years to block civil rights legislation. And that's why the Senate didn't pass an anti-lynching bill. You're not going to believe this. Until 2018.
Oh my God.
It's because the filibuster was used to block it again and again and again. Now it's what's used, and this is why it's so timely right now, to block gun violence legislation. I mean, thankfully now we do have a little bit of progress in that department, but that's been the big holdup, is the use of the filibuster, which, as I said earlier, used to be reserved for only the most emergency, like the nuclear option. If not for the filibuster, the DREAM Act would have passed in 2010. So it's interesting. But what also bears mention is that it's been weakened many, many times over the years. And this is where Democrats are very hopeful that it can be weakened again. So here's your little brief civics lesson. In 1917, the Senate instituted a means for officially cutting off debate. Before that, there was no means of stopping a filibuster at all. And by the way, the longest one is Strom Thurmond from South Carolina, who spoke literally uninterrupted. Well, little minor interruptions, but nearly uninterrupted for 24 hours and 18 minutes.
Oh my God.
Can you stand that? Can you even imagine how, that's why I guess I'll tell you, doing a talk show when the phones aren't ringing and you have to just continue to talk, a radio talk show, which, I found myself in that position just a couple of times during my radio career. That was bad enough, but I certainly never had to talk for even one full hour uninterrupted.
Wow.
Very stressful.
My gosh.
Then what happened? In 1974, the Senate eliminated the filibuster for budget bills that met certain requirements. A year later, they lowered the threshold for ending a filibuster to 60 senators. And then in 2013, they eliminated it entirely for federal executive branch appointees and judicial appointments other than the Supreme Court. And then in 2017, they eliminated it for Supreme Court nominees. And that is why we have ended up with the court that we've ended up. So the question is, how do you get rid of the filibuster? I'm glad you asked. Did you ask? I think
I'm
you asked.
curious. Please,
there you go.
Tell me.
There's that question. So all it takes is a simple majority vote in the Senate, and this can be done at any time. So Senate Democrats could introduce a big package of democracy reforms like, say, expanding voting rights and DC statehood. And then just to play this out, Mitch McConnell, who says himself that he is the grim reaper of progressive legislation, he would initiate a filibuster. Democrats could then hold a vote and with just 50 votes, eliminate the filibuster and prevent McConnell from vetoing the legislation. So there used to be a 60 vote, right? And now we know it's down to 50. But once again, we have Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. So that would be, a bit of a threat right there. So that's kind of where it stands right now. I think personally, Filibuster is a great name for a dog. And if we ever have another dog someday, I'm going to definitely see if Fred would be willing to name a dog. Don't you think? Because Buster is a classic dog's name.
Fifi.
And
Fifi.
Fifi. Well, that's a little too froofy for me. But maybe Phil. How about Phil?
Phil?
Just Phil.
That's cute.
For sure.
I like it.
Yeah.
So on that note, here are some words from our sponsors. When I listen to you say all of that, it's very clear to me that as somebody who thinks of things in relational terms, essentially the conversation about filibuster is, if the filibuster is a tantrum, whether a toddler tantrum or a grown-up throwing stuff and breaking dishes tantrum, which is it's basically the same thing. It's just that most kids eventually grow out of tantrums. If the filibuster is the nuclear option, the absolutely losing it tantrum option, the conversation is, do we or do we not want to outlaw tantrums? And by outlawing tantrums, make progress, because then we actually have to talk to each other and understand each other's sides. And Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, along with many others on their side, are saying, no, we want to keep the tantrums. We want to be able to have the nuclear option, because when we don't get what we want, we don't want to have to collaborate, cooperate, and figure it out, because it's our way or the highway. And I just think that that's at the end of the day, that's what's happening. And if I think about the impact that has on real life relationships, when there's one person, like that's what abusive relationships look like. It's either what, a parent and a toddler who's having a hard time, it's either what their relationship looks like. And in that case, it's appropriate and you figure out how to address it. And usually the kid grows out of it. But and I should say, by the way, it's usually because the kid is not getting some sort of need met, and you can address it in that way. But when it comes to adults, if there's an adult who's regularly throwing tantrums because they're not getting what they want, that's what an abusive dynamic looks like.
Let me jump in and play devil's advocate for just a moment here. And it's partly playing devil's advocate, and it's partly realizing that, for instance, we're both liberal, progressive, whatever, on that side of the fence. But imagine, if you will, a Republican, and not just a Republican, but a Trumpian Republican Senate, House, and President, where the kinds of things that are happening in Texas right now, right? Like labeling homosexual behavior as aberrant, not normal, really taking away reproductive rights, all of that becomes de facto on a national scale. Wouldn't you want there to be some mechanism for, in this case, the minority Democratic Party to stop this steamrolling of conservative? I'm not even conservative, because I don't even think conservative is a bad word, but really just repressive legislation from being enacted. I think there's a purpose to the filibuster. And I think when it was used for extreme situations, it actually served democracy well. So I don't know if my, sense about this, that I guess what I'm saying is, after doing all this reading, I think that there is a purpose and a use for the filibuster, but it's gotten completely out of hand. And I think this way of chipping away at it the way we have been over the years, and certainly more in the last 20 years than ever before, isn't exactly the smartest way. Would I be happy if voting rights were exempt from the filibuster? You bet. Would I be happy if reproductive rights were exempt from the filibuster? You bet. But I don't know if ultimately the way we should proceed is to chip away.
Well, we've been calling it the nuclear option, of absolutely going berserk. And
no, the nuclear option isn't about going berserk. The nuclear option is saving it for, so you know how the theory of the nuclear arms race is that everybody, that the USSR at the time and the US both had nuclear weapons, but nobody's actually going to use them unless something is so dire that nothing else works. So it's the threat of using them. So the threat of using the filibuster was the issue.
That's what I mean. The threat of, going berserk, of like, the threat of dropping the hammer of some sort. It's like, in order to preserve, it's like having it there, but not using it. And this doesn't exactly align with my abuse analogy, because I don't want people to feel, I'm not recommending, marriage and, relationships with your kids where there's a nuclear fear of someone becoming abusive. But yeah, I understand that. I understand the, in an ideal world, there wouldn't need to be a fear of literal nukes, because we just wouldn't do that. But I understand the concept is like, I've got, my missiles and you've got your missiles, and we know the other one has them. So let's try to have a conversation and let's try to work this through, because we don't want it to get to that. And clearly,
you know what it was called? Mutually assured destruction, which the acronym is MAD.
There you go. But, I was thinking about your question about, like, if there was something going on that was so troubling to me in a government that was entirely run by people with oppositional views to mine, would I want to have a filibuster option to protest? And the answer is yes, I definitely would. But I also think that sort of requires the climate to be one where the filibuster has kind of lost its meaning. It's lost because when it's being used with this much frequency, it's kind of like it eliminates the possibility for actual negotiation and, like we keep saying, actual progress. And so if that were an option to me in that, world where leaders who believe that women shouldn't have rights of any kind, and, that nobody but straight cis white men should be able to do anything. Of course, I would want the ability to be able to push back, but I don't know that it would mean anything, because they will just push right back against me.
Well, what's interesting about the filibuster, I think, is that it encourages devious thinking. It encourages people to say, well, what's a way around that? How can I use the law or even amend the law to my advantage so that I can put myself in a better position? All of this, and even the fact that in this country, you and I are allowed to have this conversation, I think is a sign of a thriving democracy, right? On some level, the fact that we can have all these different mechanisms within our government, and then we can change them over time. Ultimately, in a representational government, the majority should rule, right?
At
Isn't
least
that the whole
compared
point?
to a lot of other political systems, I would call this a mostly thriving democracy. Yes. Definitely.
Mostly.
Yeah.
But it is a work in progress, no doubt. And I couldn't agree with you more that the filibuster is being abused, is losing its meaning as a result. I don't think anyone ever intended for Congress to be in gridlock, the same way that a healthy relationship, as you put it, a marriage or any sort of relationship, a labor dispute, whatever, the goal ultimately is for parties to make small sacrifices for the big prize at the end of the rainbow. And really, that is why now we are going to have some meaningful gun control legislation. And, you know, the people in Congress who were willing to compromise, I mean, I think that the most progressive folks in Congress feel like they, you know, keeled over and died and didn't fight for, you know, even more meaningful legislation. But I am super grateful that any progress was made because it's been so long, and we have to start somewhere. And
I know it's hard. I also am grateful, and I'm really hopeful that that we stick the dismount on this one and actually get it passed. But I also, it's, you know, when I think about, what was it, Australia, there was one mass shooting and immediately, I mean, this is just commonplace in so many other countries where they have one little issue. It's a odd way to put it, but, you know, one instance of a mass shooting and gun laws immediately become across the board. It has taken the loss of so many lives for us to even get to a place where we feel like a tiny bit of progress is being made. And it almost is like, well, filibuster or not, that is the nuclear, like that is the nuclear option.
One would think, what is worse than a classroom of children being gunned down? What's worse? I don't know.
How many times has that happened and nobody took any action? I don't know.
I'm angry too. I'm angry too, but I also am, I'm an eternal optimist. And I think, look, I've seen, and this may be a little bit of a difference because of how many years we've lived in this society and on this planet. But I got to say, I've seen LGBTQ rights evolve faster than I might have even imagined in some ways. There are certain issues on which we've really progressed rapidly. Seatbelts is another one. I mean, nobody gets into a vehicle without putting on a seatbelt now. Cigarette smoking. I mean, it hasn't been banned, but through education and other means, it's, you know, a much smaller percentage of the populace smokes cigarettes. And as a result, we're healthier. So I'm hopeful that the same will happen for guns. There was a gun buyback program here in our county, Marin County, about as atypical a county as one might find in the United States. But a lot of people turned in their guns for money, and I think that's great. And maybe that can be spread out all across the country. Anyway, did you learn anything about filibuster today?
I learned a lot. I really did.
All right.
Thank you. You still
think it's a good dog name, though?
What's that?
You still think it's a good dog name?
I do. I especially like Bill. I think that's a good one.
Thanks so much for listening to All the F Words. She's Gabi Moskowitz. I'm Joanne Green. We love doing this, and we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at allthefwordspod@gmail.com.
And follow us on social media. We are All the F Words Pod on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. And you can listen anywhere you get your podcast.
Bye-bye.
Bye.